When I decided to camp beside the lake that bordered the back of my property, all I wanted was one peaceful night under the stars. I had spent weeks working late and needed a break-nothing fancy, just a tent, a small fire pit, and the sound of water brushing against the shore. What I didn't expect was the HOA losing its mind over it. You see, the lake wasn't some shared amenity owned by the HOA. It was technically part of my lot, included in my deed, and confirmed in the original property survey I got when I bought the home. But the HOA board, especially our power-hungry president, Miriam Cross, liked to pretend the lake was their personal kingdom. So when she saw my tent through her binoculars, she literally watched neighbors through binoculars. She decided that unauthorized overnight occupancy was a violation. I woke up to her standing at the edge of the shoreline, hands on hips, acting like she was catching a criminal. "You can't camp here," she barked. "This is common property." I calmly reminded her that the lake is on my deed and that she had no authority over it. That only made her angrier. She marched off, muttering threats about fines. I thought it would end their annoying, but manageable. Nope. 2 hours later, right as I was sipping coffee and watching the morning fog lift from the water, I heard footsteps and radios. HOA had called the police on me. 3 officers approached, clearly confused. One looked at me, at the tent, at the quiet lake, and said, "So, what exactly is the problem?" Miriam jumped in before I could answer. "He's violating HOA property rules, and we want him removed immediately." I showed the officers the deed copy I kept in my camping bag. They studied it for a moment, then turned to Miriam with raised eyebrows. "Ma'am, this lake is his." Her face drained of color instantly. The officers apologized to me, not her, and as they turned to leave, one added, "If anything, he has more right to be here than anyone else." I thought humiliation might stop her. I was wrong. That moment was just the beginning, because Miriam and the board didn't just try to control the lake. They tried to control everything. And by the time I was done exposing their corruption, the HOA didn't just lose power, they disappeared completely. Asterisk, after the police left, Miriam paced the street like she was planning a war. I watched her from my porch as she made call after call, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. Within 2 days, the HOA board released a new emergency regulation, claiming that any land touching the lake was subject to shared community oversight. In other words, they were trying to take ownership of my lake again. And this time, they did it behind closed doors. No meeting notice, no homeowner vote, nothing. They printed a rule and taped it to everyone's door like it was law. The neighbors were confused. Some thought it was ridiculous. Others didn't want trouble. But I wasn't confused at all. I knew exactly what they were trying to do. Retaliate because they got embarrassed in front of the police. So I started digging. I went through old documents the developer gave me when I bought the home surveys. Plats, easements, archived HOA bylaws from before this board took over. I even visited the county recorder's office. And what I found was explosive. The HOA's claimed authority over the lake didn't exist anywhere. Not in the covenants. Not in local ordinances. Not in any amendment. The lake was listed as privately owned by the adjacent properties, mine included. Miriam wasn't just overstepping. She was trying to rewrite land ownership without legal power. When I confronted her at the mailbox area, she smirked like she knew something I didn't. "You can fight this," she said calmly. "But remember, the HOA has ways of making life difficult." That sentence made every homeowner within hearing distance turn their head. Because everyone knew the board had a reputation selective fines, secret complaints, mysterious violations that only targeted people who questioned them. That's when I realized this wasn't about my lake anymore. Miriam ran this HOA like a mafia operation. silent intimidation, whisper campaigns, financial pressure. And everyone was too scared to stand up. Everyone except me. So I did what she hated most. I went door to door. I told neighbors what I had found. I explained how the lake ownership worked. I showed the paperwork. And one by one, they began to understand that the HOA wasn't just wrong. They were manufacturing authority they never had. That's when the board panicked. Because once the truth starts spreading, control starts slipping. And Miriam wasn't ready to lose control. Not yet. The retaliation escalated fast. 3 days after I explained the truth to the neighborhood, I received a violation notice claiming my trash can was visible from the street for more than 11 minutes. Not 10. Not 15. 11. A strangely specific number clearly meant to mock me. The next day, another notice accused me of creating disruptive outdoor displays. That display was my camping tent folded and stored in my garage. On the third day, they escalated to a $250 fine for failure to maintain harmonious aesthetics. When I asked what that meant, they said my grass was emotionally unpleasant. Emotionally unpleasant. I actually laughed when I read it, but it wasn't funny. They were laying the foundation for financial harassment, stacking made-up fines, hoping I'd either pay or break. Instead, I documented everything. Dates, times, photos, video recordings, copies of notices. I even set up motion-activated cameras pointing at my driveway and mailbox, because rumors spread that board members sometimes inspected homes when the owners weren't around. And that's when I caught them. At 2:13 a.m., my camera recorded Miriam and 2 board members creeping onto my property with flashlights, taking pictures of my siding, my walkway, my porch furniture, anything they could spin into a violation. They weren't inspecting. They were hunting. When I sent the footage to the HOA email demanding an explanation, they didn't respond. Instead, they held an emergency closed-door meeting and announced that I was under investigation for hostile conduct against the association. Hostile conduct? For sleeping in a tent and owning a lake? I realized then that the board's actions weren't just petty. They were coordinated, strategic, meant to crush opposition through intimidation. The neighbors noticed too. People whispered to me at night while walking their dogs, saying they were scared to speak out. Others told me stories of sudden violations after voting against a board amendment. One elderly couple said the HOA fined them for having an overly decorative doormat. That's when everything clicked. This wasn't an HOA anymore. It was a regime. And they thought I would be their next example. Instead, I became their biggest problem. Because after catching them trespassing, I called an emergency meeting of my own with someone the board never expected. A municipal attorney who lived 2 streets over and had been waiting years for someone brave enough to take these people on. The next morning, I arrived at my lakefront property ready to start clearing a space for the tent. The air smelled fresh, the water was calm, and sunrise painted everything gold, exactly the kind of peace I had dreamed of. But the moment I stepped out of my truck, a voice behind me said, "You're trespassing according to Section 14C of the HOA Environmental Use Policy." It was the same HOA patrol guard, a young guy named Kellen, who always seemed nervous following orders. I asked him politely to step aside because I owned this land. He hesitated, clearly unsure, but finally said, "I'm supposed to warn you that camping requires prior written approval." I laughed softly and replied, "Written approval to sleep outside? Are you serious?" He didn't answer. Instead, he radioed someone. Within minutes, 2 HOA board members walked up, dressed like they were on a military expedition. One of them, their vice president Martha, waved a clipboard in my face and insisted I stop all activity until they could evaluate my potential environmental interference. I looked around at the birds, the water, the untouched ground. Environmental interference? I asked. I'm not building a hotel. I'm pitching a tent. She didn't care. They took pictures, jotted notes, and warned me again. I told them plainly they had no authority over land outside the HOA boundary. Martha smirked and said, "Funny, we actually updated the boundary map last month." That's when she pulled out a printed map. And to my shock, they had moved the HOA border lines to include my lakefront parcel secretly without notifying me. My jaw tightened. That was illegal, and they knew it. I asked for the amendment documents. They refused. I asked for the voting record. They refused. I asked who signed the expansion. They refused. Instead, Martha simply said, "Leave voluntarily, or we'll call property enforcement." Property enforcement? That was their code word for the local deputy who always sided with them. I calmly recorded everything on my phone, told them I would not move an inch, and continued unloading my tent. They stood there, watching, whispering among themselves. For the first time, I saw fear. Not mine, but theirs, because they realized I wasn't someone they could intimidate. And that fear pushed them to the next extreme step, calling the police on me at my own lake. 20 minutes later, a sheriff's cruiser pulled up, dust rising behind it. I recognized the deputy. Harris, a guy known for turning HOA complaints into dramatic confrontations. He stepped out slowly, adjusting his sunglasses, walking toward me like I had robbed a bank. Before he could speak, I introduced myself and showed my property deed. He didn't even look at the papers. "We got a report that you're violating regulated land access," he said. Regulated access? Another made-up phrase. The HOA board hovered behind him, arms crossed, acting like they owned this lake. I handed Harris the printed copy of my land parcel, marked clearly outside the HOA's authority. He glanced at it, then said, "Well, they have a map showing otherwise." That's when I pulled out my phone and showed him something far more important, the county assessor's online map, showing the correct boundary, time-stamped and official. The deputy's confidence cracked for a moment. He stepped aside and radioed dispatch to confirm. The HOA board members started panicking, whispering intensely, acting like children caught lying on a school project. When dispatch radioed back confirming my boundary was correct, Harris changed his tone. But instead of admitting the HOA was wrong, he tried to salvage himself. "Regardless, sir, they are concerned you may start unpermitted construction." Construction? I pointed to my tent bag. "This is camping, not development." Suddenly, Kellen, the nervous guard, spoke up. He didn't do anything wrong. He just wanted to camp. Martha glared at him, but it was too late. The deputy had heard enough. He finally turned to the HOA board and said, "Unless you have legal documentation supporting your claim, this man is free to use his property." The HOO was furious. Martha tried arguing, waving her fake map, but the deputy wouldn't budge. They stomped away, threatening future consequences, but they knew they had lost that round. As the patrol and board members retreated, the deputy leaned toward me and said quietly, "They're going to escalate this. Be ready." And I was. Because now I realized something deeper. This wasn't just about camping. The HOA desperately wanted my land for a reason they hadn't revealed yet, and they were willing to break the law to get it. And if they wanted a fight, I was about to show them one they couldn't win. Asterisk that night. After the confrontation with the deputy and the HOA's embarrassing retreat, I stayed at the lake just to see if they would try anything else. The water reflected the moon like a silver ribbon, and the quiet was almost healing until I noticed headlights creeping down the trail leading to my land. I turned off my lantern and watched carefully. It wasn't the sheriff. It wasn't a neighbor. It was a pair of HOA board members in their golf cart, moving slowly, stopping every few feet as if they were searching for something. They weren't looking for me. They were inspecting the land itself. One of them jumped out and planted a small red flag near the water. Then another flag. Then another. They were marking something. I stayed hidden in the shadows until they finished and drove off. When I finally walked over to inspect the flags, I froze. The markers formed a perfect rectangle large, enough to be a construction foundation. And right in the center was a wooden stake labeled HOA Development Phase 2. My stomach dropped. So that was it. They didn't want my land because of camping rules. They wanted to seize it for their new project. The next morning, I visited the county office, pretending I was just curious about local permits. When I searched the records, my suspicion became confirmed reality. The HOA had submitted a preliminary plan to build a private lakeside pavilion, a multi-million-dollar amenity to raise property value. And the blueprint showed that my lakefront acreage was the centerpiece of their proposed build. They needed my land to finish their Phase 2. They didn't have the authority. They didn't have my consent. But in their minds, they already owned it. On the drive back, anger simmered beneath my ribs. They lied about boundaries, manipulated maps, and called the cops just to corner me into giving up my property. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized they had overplayed their hand. Because now that they opened the door, it was my turn to step through it with something they never expected. My advantage wasn't force or intimidation. It was the one thing HOA boards fear more than lawsuits: angry homeowners and public backlash combined, exposing corruption with undeniable evidence. So I went back home, opened my laptop, and started preparing a counterstrike that would shake the entire HOA from the inside out. And once it started, there would be no stopping it. I began my plan by tracking every interaction I'd had with the HOA, every warning letter, every fake citation, every boundary dispute, every police call. I saved photos, videos, timestamps, and maps. Then I dug deeper. I started talking to neighbors quietly, one by one. And the stories I heard made mine seem mild. One family said the HOA fined them $300 because their driveway had excessive shade from a tree they didn't even plant. Another homeowner told me the HOA threatened to sue him for improperly colored curtains visible from the street. People were afraid, exhausted, and fed up, but they didn't know how to fight back. They thought they were alone. They weren't. I compiled everything into a folder I titled HOA Abuse Files. Then I requested something the HOA never wanted me to see: their financial records, which by law they must provide to any community member upon request. The treasurer stalled, made excuses, delayed for days. So I sent an official written demand. That forced them to respond. When the documents arrived, there were mess pages missing, numbers crossed out, totals that made no sense. But the remaining information was enough. The HOA had been funneling funds from community maintenance into a private project enhancement budget with no signatures, no approval, no community vote. And the amount missing? Almost identical to what they estimated for the pavilion project that required my land. But that wasn't even the worst part. Buried inside the statements was a payment made to a land survey contractor 5 months ago. The note attached: boundary adjustment preparation. That was the proof. They hadn't updated the map. They had paid someone to redraw it, knowing it was illegal. And they used that altered map to target me. Now I had everything I needed: evidence of misconduct, financial manipulation, boundary fraud, and abusive enforcement. It was checkmate, but I wanted more than just winning. I wanted the whole HOA structure that bullied homeowners for years to crumble so completely that no one could rebuild it. So I created a digital file with all the evidence and queued it for release. One click, and every homeowner, every county official, every lawyer, and every state committee would receive it simultaneously. And once the world saw what this HOA was doing, they wouldn't just lose the battle. They would disappear. The next morning, I woke up with one goal: finish this. The HOA had spent months pushing boundaries, bending laws, and bullying homeowners. And now that their entire scheme sat neatly in my evidence folder, it was time to pull the trigger. But to make sure this hit with maximum impact, I wanted one more thing: a first-hand confession. Not forced, not scripted, just a board member thinking they were safe enough to reveal the truth. So I set a trap. I drove over to the HOA office, pretending I wanted to cooperate and resolve the conflict peacefully. I told them I had reconsidered camping on my land and wanted to talk about possible compromises. Their eyes lit up immediately. The president leaned forward, like a vulture spotting a dying animal. "We can discuss options," he said, "as long as you're willing to work with us." I nodded, giving him room to talk. And he talked. He admitted the lake project was crucial for property value, said my land was the only viable location, and even admitted the boundary shift was something they took initiative on because the county was too slow. Every word recorded, every sentence a rope tightening around their neck. After 30 minutes of him bragging about the pavilion plans and hinting at deals with contractors, I thanked him and walked out. That was the last civil conversation we would ever have. I went home, loaded the final audio file into the evidence folder, and reviewed everything one last time. Then I hit send. In seconds, over 200 homeowners received a full report of the HOA's illegal land manipulation, financial fraud, misuse of community funds, abusive enforcement patterns, and the recorded confession. I watched the email list spike with message receipts and auto-replies from county officials, the state HOA oversight board, and my favorite journalists. Then I leaned back in my chair and waited, not for retaliation, for impact. And the impact came fast. Within 2 hours, the neighborhood group chats exploded. Residents who had been quiet for years suddenly found courage they'd never had before. Screenshots spread like wildfire messages from furious homeowners demanding emergency meetings, refund explanations, and resignations. One neighbor wrote, "I knew they were corrupt, but this?" Another posted, "They stole our money for a lake party house." Meanwhile, the HOA board tried scrambling to do damage control. They sent a panicked email claiming that everything was taken out of context and that the documents were inaccurate. But no one bought it. The numbers didn't lie. The audio didn't lie. And the legally required financial documents signed by their own treasurer didn't lie. By noon, the county inspector's truck rolled into the neighborhood. 10 minutes later, a second car arrived, this one marked with the state regulatory seal. And trailing behind them, a local investigative news crew with cameras rolling. I walked outside to watch the show. Board members were pulled aside, questioned one by one. The treasurer looked like she was about to faint. The president kept wiping sweat from his upper lip. Homeowners gathered in small crowds, whispering, filming, documenting every second. Then came the moment everything shifted. The county official announced loudly enough for everyone to hear, "The HOA board is hereby suspended pending further investigation." Cheers erupted. Someone actually started clapping in rhythm. The president tried to protest, but the official cut him off. "Sir, your administrative authority is revoked as of this moment." In one single afternoon, the HOA's power collapsed. Their emails, fines, threats, and harassment meant nothing. Their planned takeover of my land was gone. Their multi-million-dollar pavilion? Dead. Their control over the neighborhood? Dust. And I didn't have to shout or fight or break anything. I just turned on the lights and watched the roaches scatter. Asterisk. The fallout over the next week was nothing short of historic. With the HOA board suspended, the state-appointed investigator took temporary control and immediately opened a full audit. What they found only made things worse for the former board. Falsified invoices, missing funds, private contractor kickbacks, unapproved land surveys, unauthorized legal expenditures, and a secret side account used to finance their lake pavilion fantasy. Every new discovery stacked another brick on the tower of consequences collapsing over their heads. When the homeowners gathered for an emergency community meeting, I showed up expecting chaos. But what I saw instead was unity. People who had lived in fear of letters and fines were now speaking openly, demanding accountability, laughing in disbelief at the corruption the board had hidden for years. And when the investigator asked if anyone wanted to nominate an interim committee, dozens of hands shot up. For the first time in a long time, the neighborhood felt alive again. A few days later, I received a formal letter from the county. The land dispute? Resolved permanently in my favor. The HOA's altered boundary lines were declared invalid, the attempted enforcement void, and the board's interference officially documented as unlawful. The county even included an apology for the inconvenience caused by unauthorized HOA actions. But the best part came last in email from the news station. The story had aired. HOA exposed after homeowner releases damning footage. The video racked up millions of views overnight. Comment sections were full of people sharing their own HOA nightmares, cheering the takedown and laughing at the board's ridiculous downfall. The next day, as I walked near the lake, I stopped at the exact spot where this entire mess started, my camping chair still sitting by the water. Calm, quiet, untouched. My land, my rights, my peace. I sat down, opened a cold drink, and watched the sunset spread across the water like molten gold. No shouting, no threats, no HOA. In the end, I didn't just win a fight. I removed a tyrant, exposed corruption, and gave my neighborhood back its freedom. And as the last bit of sunlight disappeared behind the trees, one thought stayed in my mind. When you shine a light on the truth, even the biggest HOA can disappear.